I'm Esmé Cowles, and I'm here to talk about shifting gears, about what digital projects look like when you can't digitize anything. So before COVID, we had a lot of work to do, but we really felt like we had a great team. We had a great platform for doing digital projects and digitization. The core of that was our repository for building objects. That's our Samvera application Figgy. We had a IIIF ecosystem to make that viewer based on those objects in the repository and have that show up in the repository so you can review things as you work on them, and also show up in the front end of the applications. Both our sort of bread and butter, catalog and finding aids discovery applications, and more focused ones like our Maps portal or our digital collection site based on Spotlight. And we were syncing metadata for the most part, where if we had metadata in the finding aid or in MARC, we were able to sync that metadata around. But we definitely had some pain points. We built workflows for review and approval that had never really been worked, never really used the way we'd planned for them to be used, I guess I would say. A lot of things were ingested and then sort of bulk approved and pushed out. Definitely a lot of technical debt, a lot of sort of one-off applications and access applications floating around. Everybody was really busy, both in IT and across the library. And a particular problem we had identified is that metadata conservation and IT work were really underestimated as part of that process. That we felt like we had a good ability to estimate and prioritize the digitization work sort of narrowly defined, but that penumbra of supporting work always seemed to get underestimated. And we had begun to work on that. We had sort of revised our project proposal process and had a call for proposals that would require metadata and conservation sign-off and department head sign-off for prioritization. And that call for proposals was due on April 10th, which, just for reference for anybody, that was the height of the first wave of COVID in New Jersey. So when COVID hit, there was a brief period of time where we were just trying to scramble and figure out how to work. A lot of our staff in IT had been working from home, either full-time remote workers or occasional teleworkers, and so that was not such a big concern. But a lot of our staff across the library had never worked from home, and so just figuring out who needed a laptop, whether people could work from home, negotiating with the union about what that looked like, was a huge amount of the focus. And then starting to think about everything else, like, well, we have digitization workflows that involve shipping hard drives around. Well, shipping and receiving got hard when our campus mailroom was overwhelmed and our library mailrooms were closed. We also spent some time just trying to help newly remote staff adjust, so reaching out to people, offering our expertise, and sharing our experiences. And after a couple of weeks of that mode, I would say it really began to sink in that this was not a short-term thing, that this was going to be a long-term situation that we would need to live with. And so we started asking ourselves, what do digital projects look like if we're closed indefinitely? And we weren't closed indefinitely. We were closed for a few months, and by the summer, we were open again in a limited capacity. But to the degree that we were open, it was for pickup and digitization focused really on teaching and research. And so there really, even now, is very little bandwidth for digitization for sort of discretionary, curator-driven digital projects, exhibits, a lot of the things that used to drive the majority of our digitization. So I wouldn't say that we're in a world with zero digitization, but very little. And that's sort of where we expect to be. So I wanted to talk today about sort of how we've reacted to that and share some of our thoughts and some of our ideas. And I really hope to hear in the questions and later on what other people have been up to, because I'm sure everybody has reacted to this in a million ways. So the first thing we worked on was the stuff that was digitized but hadn't really made it through the whole process or was languishing in an old system. We still had some old applications, exhibits, an old version of our digital library platform, various things that had been photographed and never ingested. So there was a lot of content that we could revisit to do the metadata work, to do the ingest work, whatever needed to be done. And as we revisited some of those, we found that a lot of change had happened. In some cases, there were staff changes that had happened, and the new curators were more flexible and open to different ideas. We also found that the new imperative to make content accessible really changed how people interacted with us and what they were open to. In the past, I think there was a really high expectation of being able to have things be perfect. And given that the highest priority of the library was making as much content available as possible to support teaching and research, I think there was a feeling that it was okay if it wasn't perfect. We didn't have to resolve every single issue. It was enough to get things up online good enough. We also found some new possibilities for collaboration. A lot of our staff all of our staff at the beginning were working from home and couldn't do everything that they could normally do. And so we're looking for work or had availability and bandwidth to work on things that in the past would not have been possible. And in some cases, it had been a year or more since we had talked to people or revisited a project. And in those situations, we found that, in some cases, the application functionality had improved enough that we could now handle things that we couldn't have handled before. So that let us move a couple of projects along. One of the ones I'm sort of most grateful for being able to move along is our Western Americana collection. It's our biggest photography collection. And it had been stuck for years because it had photo albums with both pictures of the photo pages with sometimes multiple pages and marginalia and legends and things. But it also had photographs of each individual photograph. And we kind of struggled with how to represent that and the work necessary to make that work well. And the new curator said, you know what, we really need to get this collection up. It's untenable to not have this in our new system. Let's just do the photographs and we'll worry about the books later. We were also able to move forward with a new version of our performance archive that was a digital audio application that replaced an old Access application. So that was great to move forward. We did some development work to support that and other ingest. Things like we'd had persistent problems with Google Drive upload not working, which some of our users were using. And we had a hard time debugging that because the developers who were mostly working on that functionality could not reproduce the problem. But a lot of people, including myself, got it 100% of the time. It just didn't work. But we added drag and drop ingest to the repository, which gave people another sort of easy to use functionality that didn't require using a staging server. We were working on migrating a number of our collections from special collections, which led us to improve the metadata extraction. So when we synchronized metadata from our EADs, we did a better job of extracting properties. And when we did start scanning, we really had a lot of people who were not used to using the repository, scanning content that was going into the repository to support course reserves. So we automated PDF ingest, so taking PDFs, splitting them apart into page images, and automatically assigning them the right collections and things. And that really helped people ingest a lot more and maximize the scanning time in the library. We also spent some time enriching existing content. So when I mentioned those workflows that never really worked, one of those was that we really expected that catalogers and curators would review and enrich and approve content sort of in a pretty manual, hands-on process. And that's just not really the way things worked in practice. But because we had a lot of staff who were working from home who needed work to do, we put those people to work working on adding page numbers, adding tables of contents, just going through and looking at things, identified problems that needed to be resolved. And so that was mostly work that IT coordinated and supported, but staff throughout the library were working on. We did add some features to support that work to make the workflow work for that sort of work a little bit better, especially because there were a lot of people in different groups working together, and so we wanted to avoid duplication. So we added some facets to our repository to identify things that had structure or didn't, so you could identify things that needed to be improved. A date limit in our repository. We had that in some of our user-facing apps before, but never in the repository. So adding that so that you could find, for example, public domain content that could easily be made public if it had been finished and approved. And then a claim feature. So instead of our first approach to that was making spreadsheets and assigning objects for different people to work on. But we quickly switched to having a button for people to claim things. So you could tell if a thing was claimed or not, and if it was claimed by you. And so that would let you sort of coordinate with a large group of people and not have people stepping on each other's toes. And so a lot of our work in IT, and this is mostly Kim Lehman, my co-author here as our IT project manager, really working with a lot of staff, explaining the purpose and the benefits of this work, explaining the usability benefits of having a table of contents in a book to make it more navigable and things like that. Providing training and workflow documentation so that people knew what to do, answering questions when people had them, and coordinating staff from multiple departments. A lot of the staff were either in the general collections departments or in the studio, and a lot of the content came from our special collections department. And so just making sure that people could work across departments, coordinate and collaborate effectively was a big part of it. And so the benefits we saw from this were a couple of expected benefits, like making our digital objects more usable, and allowing staff who are working from home to make a concrete contribution toward a high priority for the library. Those are sort of the reasons why we started this work, but some of the other benefits were maybe not as obvious, like a number of our staff speak various languages that we have content in, and they were able to put their language skills to use when working with these materials. Some of our staff were using the repository to ingest content and then didn't really know the rest of the application. And so this gave them a chance to learn more about the application, use sort of the rest of the workflow. And one of the things that was most surprising and really heartening to me was having staff report that they really appreciated being part of a team. Working together in groups to tackle a project and work through a collection and get all the objects paginated was something that people found really rewarding. So in addition to those sort of getting new content going, we also worked with special collections, particularly on reusing existing content. We built a Spotlight exhibit to explain how to build Spotlight exhibits in our Spotlight instance, digital PUL. We provided a lot of training and individual support too, so it wasn't just documentation, but it was really working with them to streamline the workflow, to make it easier to select things from multiple collections. In the past, the vast majority of our exhibits had been based on a single collection and really driven by either a topical sort of collection or focus within that collection, or driven by an exhibit, also very thematic and focused on a single collection most of the time. And so identifying things from across different collections was a big part of that. And obviously a lot of training and outreach to sort of encourage people to do this kind of work and to brainstorm with them how to make that process easier so that they could sort of use the wealth of content that we already had. And we're really happy about having a couple of exhibits come out of that, including this one, Ho for the Open Country, just talking about the urban parks movement, which we thought was a great thing to pull things from a couple of different collections together. And then there's sort of a few other things that I wanted to talk about, different kinds of collaborations. We had one collection that had a sort of outsourced metadata creation. This is our South Asian ephemera collection that had a vendor in India that wanted to access our system and add metadata. And to some degree, we had that in place, but there was definitely some work there to make that all work in coordinating all of that and some recently added features around restricting certain kinds of contributors to a single collection so that they could work with just the collection they were contracted to work on. A save draft feature to let people sort of add incomplete metadata and have somebody else sort of have that handed off to them and finish it and publish it. We also had some vendors transition. One of the vendors we were working with and had several collections in process went out of business and was required by another vendor. And so there was a lot of back and forth about how our materials were being handled and moving things over to the new vendor that was going to assume that project. We talked to a lot of faculty members about a lot of things, especially early in the spring. We had some ideas about working on annotations and transcription projects and other things for the fall. We didn't really embark on any big software development efforts in those areas. We mostly wound up using things that we already had in place. But there was a lot of discussion and a lot of openness, I think, to exploring different ways of doing things that we hope will bear fruit in the coming years. And we've also had some staff scanning and transcribing at home. So the image here is one from our bird journal collection, a naturalist who was just taking censuses of birds that he saw. And we had photographed all of those, but this is really a data set in the making. And so there was a lot of transcription work to turn those into usable data that staff could do from home. We also worked with a couple of different platforms on getting our collections out into the world and other places where users might find them. We sort of improved support for OAI harvesting. One of the main projects that made use of that was the France in the Americas project, which is being run by the BNF to collect materials about France, French experience in the Americas, and also made some improvements for our digital Chicken Yara, another multi-institution project that we participate in. We've begun contributing some of our manuscript objects to the OPEN repository, which mostly involved metadata review and some metadata enhancement, and just coordinating with the OPEN folks. And then prioritizing digitization. To the degree that digitization requests kept coming in, we did some work to just figure out which of those were really instructional in nature and which ones were not, and sort of separate those out and help prioritize which ones needed immediate attention. And so the bottom line for me is that a lot of this work really improved access to our collections. It made content that was hidden or in older systems and hard to find more visible, easier to discover. It made some of the content that was already public easier to work with. It helped a lot of our staff be productive and make a real contribution to important work that was going on in those early months, especially. And we really built some relationships and encouraged collaboration across the library. That's sort of a strategic goal for our library overall. And so we were really happy to encourage that kind of collaboration across different kinds of departments. So that is my presentation. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Esmé. There are a few questions in this channel. First one is, what sort of IT work was underestimated? Infrastructure, DevOps, things like provisioning and deploying?
I would say the biggest category is the building and operation of exhibits. We have a Spotlight instance, and we'd sort of built that assuming that people were going to, that our curators and librarians were going to use that functionality to build their own exhibits. But what we found was that a lot of exhibits wound up being made as sort of offshoots of physical exhibits, and the work translating the physical exhibit materials into the digital exhibit wound up being pushed onto IT because the curators didn't have the time or the skills to do that work. And the other category of IT work that I think was really underestimated was when there wasn't a feature, when there was feature work that needed to be done in order to support a new content type or a new workflow wrinkled or a new metadata source, I think there was often not an understanding of how that work was, or a good way of bringing that into the proposal process. So I think that's always a work in process.
That sounds good, thanks. Next question is by Robin. She's asking, has Princeton considered using Spotlight to enable non-librarians to build focused collection exhibits? For example, students or faculty?
We have one of those faculty collaborations that I mentioned is with a faculty member who has a number of grad students working on a project, and they're working on building an exhibit right now. We don't really expect that to go live in Spotlight. We expect that to be a data source for another application. So that's maybe not the best example. We have been talking with our museum and our Teaching and Learning Center, the McGraw Center, about student work and students, especially in classes, integrating materials both from the library and the museum and our art and archaeology department. And so we've thought about whether our Spotlight instance would be a good platform for bringing those things together. To a large degree, I think we felt like there's a lot of different use cases in that Spotlight application, where it has both sort of digital copies of physical exhibits and some of these thematic things, and maybe digital collections more broadly. And so we're a little hesitant about expanding it to student work, but it's definitely a thing we've thought about.
That sounds good. Next question is by Meredith Hale. And the question is, can you elaborate on what you mean by improve OAI? Just make sure that all collections like France and the Americas are present in OAI.
Sure. When we built our OAI support, which was actually very recent, it only supported items that had MARC records, because the main project we built it for was the Chicken project, where all of the items had MARC records. So one of the big things was making sure that it would support any kind of records and generate Dublin core metadata, at least for everything, so that anything that was in our repository could be harvested over OAI.